This video is made for learners with visual impairment of the Philippine National School for the Blind. Ang video na ito ay nakalaan para sa mga mag-aaral na may kapansanan sa paningin ng Philippine National School for the Blind. Welcome to the world of science! This is the second installment of our 3-part video series on the nervous system. Kung hindi mo pa napapanood ang unang video, ay tignan muna ang description box para sa link nito. Today, we are going to talk about the basic unit of the nervous system called the neuron, spelled as N-E-U-R-O-N. Handa ka na ba? Listen carefully as we discuss today's lesson. Balikan muna natin ang ating mga pinag-aralan on the previous video. We discussed the parts of the nervous system which are the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. We also described the functions of the nervous system and summarized it into sensation, response, and integration. If you think you are confident that you understood this video, let's proceed now to today's lesson. Now, let's talk about the parts and functions of a neuron. Ano nga ba ang neuron? The neuron is the basic unit or the building block of your nervous system. It carries messages going back and forth to your brain and your body. Now, what we can see here is a picture of a neuron which looks very different from the cells na pabilog that we already know. Because this one is thin and has long extensions which we will further describe and identify later. However, a neuron comes in many forms, shapes, and sizes. But I think it is helpful to think of a neuron like a tree or puno because the extensions look like the branches of the tree that can connect to other neurons. The next animation that is shown here are the neurons inside your brain. Your brain is actually made of 100 billion neurons. So, gaano ba yun kadami? Sabihin na natin na ang isang butil ng bigas ay 100,000. So, ang 10 butil ng bigas ay 1 million. 1 million pa lang yun. Ang 10,000 butil ng bigas ay 1 billion. I-multiply pa natin ang 10,000 sa 100 in order to get 100 billion. So, in short, para kang may 1,000,000 butil ng bigas o 26 kilograms ng bigas to get 100 billion. So, we can just imagine how small or how tiny these neurons are to fit inside our brain. Now, it is also noticeable on the animation that these neurons seem to spark or light up. This happens because the messages that a neuron carries are called electrochemical signals. Para talaga siyang boltahe ng kuryente na magsaspark kung ito ay aktibo. When the neurons are active and working, they flash as electric impulses pass through them. Mabilis at sunod-sunod itong nangyayari. That's why these series of bright lights fired by the neurons really look wonderful kapag ito ay iyong ginagamit. Now, let's talk about the two major types of neurons which are the sensory and the motor neurons. The sensory neurons carry messages from the body going to your brain. While the motor neurons, motor means movement, carries messages from the brain going to the body. There are actually other types of neurons, but these two are those that we can connect to the functions that we have talked about. So, sensory neurons are responsible for sensation, and motor neurons are responsible for giving responses. Let's now discuss the 3 major parts of a neuron. Earlier, we described that a neuron looks like a tree that branches out. The branches of a tree can be compared to the first part which is called dendrite. D-E-N-D-R-I-T-E. Now, Now, dendrites are branch-like extensions at one end of a neuron that receives messages and brings it to the next part, which is called soma or cell body. Tandaan na ang dendrites is for receiving. Now we move on to the next part, which we can compare to the upper part of a tree's trunk. We will call it soma, S-O-M-A, or the cell body. In the soma, we can find the nucleus or the control center of the cell. Now, this means that the messages that are received by the dendrites are carried to the soma for processing kasi nandoon ang nucleus. The last part is called an axon, A-X-O-N, which we can compare to the trunk and the roots of a tree. It is long and can extend from 1 millimeter to 1 meter long. Now, these axons, in contrast to the dendrites, kasi ang dendrites ay nagre-receive ng messages papunta sa cell body, axons naman carries the message away from the cell body going to the next neuron. So, tandaan natin na that the dendrites are for receiving, the soma is for processing, and the axons are for carrying messages away from the neuron. Now, I know that not every one of us has seen or was able to touch a tree. That's why i-compare na lang natin ang neuron sa ating mga kamay at braso. I want you to extend your arm sideward. Naka-extend na ba? Let's make another comparison. Your fingers this time will represent your dendrites. And you use your fingers to get things, tama ba? So maaalala ninyo na ang dendrite is responsible for receiving or getting the messages. Your palm o ang inyong mga palad naman ay i-compare natin sa ating soma or cell body. This is where the messages are processed. Now from your wrist to your forearm, your elbow joint to your upper arm, that long arm can be compared to your axon. Again, axon carries messages away from the neuron. Let's also talk about the other parts of a neuron. Let's look closely at the axon. The axon is actually protected by a fat or a lipid layer called myelin sheath. M-Y-E-L-I-N-S-H-E-A-T-H. This protects and insulates the neuron para mabilis at epektibong dumaloy ang electrical impulses sa ating nerve cells. This myelin sheath is produced by cells called Schwann cells, capital S-C-H-W-A-N-N cells. They say that ang pagiging ulyanin natin can be associated with the deterioration of the myelin sheath as we age. Ang ibig sabihin nito na ang myelin sheath na pumoprotekta sa ating neurons can be damaged as we age. So, pag ito ay nasira, maaaring hindi na epektibo ang pagdaloy ng electrical impulses sa ating nerve cells, which can contribute to forgetfulness habang tayo ay tumatanda. Another part of our neuron which is located on the other end are called axon terminals. This is the end part of a neuron which looks like little roots with round or circular ends. This part of the neuron is very important in understanding how the messages are transmitted from one neuron to another. This round end, sometimes described as botones, are called synapse or synapses. S-Y-N-A-P-S-E. Inside the synapse are the messages that are carried by the nervous system. Basically, there are two types of synapse, the electric and chemical synapses. However, majority of the neurons carry chemical synapses. Your axon communicates the messages to the next or receiving neuron, but they are not touching each other. Hindi sila magkadikit. There is a really small but important space or gap between two neurons. This is called a synaptic gap. Importante na may space para ma-regulate at makontrol ang dami ng chemical signals na ipapasa from one neuron to another. Let's look closely to what happens in the synaptic gap. Your presynaptic neuron o ang neuron na nagbibigay ng mensahe releases messages as chemicals. We call these neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that balances the communication between two neurons. Now, we will use shapes to symbolize neurotransmitters. In this picture of synapse, we use triangles. We can see here that the triangles are released by the presynaptic neuron and floats around the synaptic gap, waiting to be received by the receiving neuron or the postsynaptic neuron. Ang ibig sabihin nito, ang giving neuron o ang presynaptic neuron ay nagre-release ng neurotransmitters na magsistay muna sa synaptic gap bago tanggapin ng postsynaptic or receiving neurons. Once ma-release ang neurotransmitters, the receiving neuron prepares its receptors, which are special kinds of proteins that fit to the shape or structure of the neurotransmitter. Again, the giving neuron or presynaptic neuron releases neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap and will be received by the receptors in the receiving or postsynaptic neuron. Now, why do we have to understand neurotransmitters? The action of neurotransmitters actually explains why addiction can happen. Let's take a look at this example. Adenosine. Adenosine. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter that is released for us to sleep and relax. Kapag nakakaramdam na ng pagod ang ating katawan, our brain will signal the neurons to release adenosine. In this illustration, we will use blue inverted triangles to represent adenosine. Ito naman ay tatanggapin ng receiving neuron with its receptor that can accommodate the exact shape of the adenosine. Ang ibig sabihin, kung baliktad na triangle ang shape ng neurotransmitter, ito ay dapat eksaktong magkasya sa receptor na tatanggap lamang na triangle na shape. Normally, if adenosine is transmitted without problems, then you can sleep well. However, sabihin na natin na gusto mong magpuyat para mag-aral, kaya ikaw ay uminom ng kape. Ang coffee ay naglalaman ng caffeine na maaaring pumunta sa iyong synaptic gap. At hindi mo aakalain na caffeine actually looks like adenosine. Para siyang poser. Parehong-pareho ang itsura niya sa adenosine. It also looks like an inverted triangle. In this video, we are going to use a red triangle. Ang mangyayari kapag ikaw ay uminom ng kape, instead of adenosine fitting the receptors, the caffeine in your coffee actually goes to the receptor. Kasya siya eh. So, hindi ka nakatulog. Pero, ang totoong nangyayari, pagod na ang cells mo kaka-work. So, the brain will receive a message na, pagod na kami, we need to rest. So, it will think na you need more adenosine. So, more receptors will be made in order to receive the extra adenosine na inutos ng iyong brain. Then, the effects of caffeine will eventually wear off. Kaya kapag ikaw ay matutulog na at hindi ka na nagkape, pansinin mo, ikaw ay tulog na tulog. This is because your neurons release an extra amount of adenosine and receptors. Now you become addicted to coffee because you now have several receptors for adenosine. Dahil marami ng receptors, marami ng kape ang kailangan mo to fill in those receptors. You might even think na wala ng effect yung kape. The worst is, because ang dami mo ng receptors, your neurons now will need to release more adenosine, kaya kapag hindi ka nakakainom ng kape, ay pagod na pagod at tulog na tulog ka. And since you need to wake up, you will drink more and more coffee in order to stay awake. But what really happens in your synaptic gap is the battle of adenosine versus caffeine to fit to the receptor. Unfortunately, drugs can also happen in this manner. Did you learn something today? Again, we discussed the parts and functions of a neuron. If you understood the lesson, write your 3 takeaways on the comment section below. You may also share your coffee addiction story. For our next video, we will be discussing the divisions of the nervous system. Thank you for watching.